Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we will return to the Gospel of John. That gospel is unique in presenting extended dialogues or conversations between Jesus and others. For example, we treated Jesus as he met with Nicodemus at night in John chapter 3, and as he had had a long talk with the unnamed Samaritan woman at the well in John 4. The story of Jesus' encounter with a blind man in John 9 fits this same mold. This story, as we shall soon see, also has an ironic twist. The episode begins when Jesus and his disciples happen on a man who had been blind from birth. That is mentioned in verse 1. Because of a common belief that physical frailty was sometimes the result of sin, the disciples asked Jesus about the man's condition. They wanted to know whether his blindness was caused by his own sin or something that his parents had done. That's in verse 2. When they asked this question, they addressed Jesus as rabbi. A rabbi was supposed to know the answer to a difficult question like this. Jesus responded that sin had nothing to do with the fact that this man was blind. That's in verse 3. Instead, he insisted that the blindness was an opportunity for God's work to be made manifest in this man. At this point, Jesus did what he often did in this gospel, namely, launch into a lesson about God's mission and Jesus' role in that mission. Jesus noted that while it was still daytime, work must be done. At night, it is impossible to work. Then Jesus insists that he is the light of the world, meaning that while he is around, it is time to get to work. That's in verse 4. Of course, Jesus is not talking about ordinary working conditions, but the work God had sent him to do. This is the work of various sorts of ministry in which Jesus was engaged. Having said that, Jesus performs a prophetic act. Often, prophets did something to illustrate things that they were articulating. Jesus went into this prophetic mode. To do that, he spat on the dust and made a little patch of clay from the moistened dust, whereupon he put the concoction on the man's eyes. After this, Jesus ordered the man to go wash in the pool of Siloam, a word that means sent, thereby underscoring that Jesus had been sent himself to do ministry of this sort. Remarkably, without asking a single question, the blind man did exactly as he was told. After he washed in the pool, he returned to where he was, only this time he had regained his sight. Jesus had performed a miracle or sign, as is typical of this gospel. That's in verse 7. When the man returned, he apparently took up a spot where he had regularly begged. This meant that the man was easily recognized and known by people who frequented this area. That's in verse 8. Once people saw this man, now having regained his sight, they could not believe their own eyes. Some thought that this man, who now could see, was without question the blind beggar they were used to seeing. Others thought that this could not be the same man. He only resembled the blind man. Blind men do not come back with regained sight. The man himself, though, settled the dispute by saying, "I am the man." That's in verse 9. Once he said this, the people were astounded and wanted to know how the man regained his sight. That's in verse 10. The man's answer was straightforward. It was simple, actually. The man named Jesus put clay on my eyes and told me to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. I did just that. And next thing I know, I could see. That's in verse 11. The man could not have been more matter of fact in his statement. Of course, the people then wanted to know where this Jesus fellow was. The formerly blind man answered truthfully, I do not know. That's in verse 12. All of a sudden, what had happened turned into a full-blown controversy. It turns out that all of this took place on the Sabbath day, which meant that no work was of any kind was permitted for faithful Jews. When Jesus made the clay, for some that classified as work and therefore a violation of Sabbath protocol. The Pharisees were especially careful about Sabbath observance. So it was only natural that people brought the man to see the Pharisees. When the man explained what Jesus had done and said prior to his receiving his sight, the Pharisees were skeptical. They did not think that this action was something that God could sanction, in that Jesus had not been scrupulous in keeping the Sabbath regulations by refraining from any work of any kind. That's in verse 16. But not everyone agreed with this assessment. Others, perhaps even other Pharisees, said that a sign like this could not have been performed by someone who blatantly sinned by working on the Sabbath. Once again, the man who had been blind was asked about this. From the man's point of view, there is only one thing to say. He is a prophet. Jesus had acted like a prophet when he put the clay on the man's eyes and ordered him to wash. Who could have done something like that if not a prophet? Some folks, though, remained unconvinced. So they went back to the issue of identity. Perhaps people had mistaken whether this man who now sees was indeed the blind beggar. The man's parents could easily end the dispute. When the parents were questioned, they readily identified him as their son, but had no clue as to how he could now see. However, the parents were reticent to say anything else about the matter because of the controversy that had developed around this man named Jesus. Pressure was being applied that anyone confessing Jesus to be the Messiah risked expulsion from the synagogue. That's in verses 18 to 22. In any case, the man was old enough to speak for himself. His parents encouraged people to ask him who he was and what had happened to him. That's in verse 23. Just as his parents suggested, the people put their questions again to the formerly blind man. Only this time around, they signal that they will only accept one answer. They are willing to acknowledge that the man could now see, but they insisted that the man praise God for this. Because of his violation of the Sabbath rules, obviously, Jesus was a sinner. That's in verse 24. Since the man knew little about Jesus, he admitted that he had no idea whether he was a sinner or not. What he did know, however, and was willing to testify to, was that he had been blind and was now able to see. And he repeated that testimony. That's in verse 25. Remaining incredulous, the people demanded to know precisely what Jesus had done to bring this about. That's in verse 26. The man responded that he had gone over all of that previously. What was the point of reiterating? If the people had not listened to his testimony previously, why should they listen a second or third time around? Then, perhaps a little tongue-in-cheek, he asked whether they wanted him to repeat what he had said so that they could become his disciples. That's in verse 27. This was the last straw. Angered by this impertinent question that challenged their religious commitments, they accused the man of being one of Jesus' disciples, whereas they claimed to be disciples of Moses. That's in verse 28. At least they believed that God had spoken to Moses, but they had serious doubts about this Jesus chap. That's in verse 29. When they said this, the man became exasperated. How is it, the man wanted to know, that you do not know where this man comes from, yet he opened my eyes? Of course, only God can do that, the man continued. But God surely would not listen to an outright sinner. Instead, God listens to anyone who is a true worshiper and who does God's will. That's in verses 30 and 31. The man was not through with his tirade. Who has ever heard of a man who could make the blind see? If this man who did just that were not from God, he could do nothing. That's verses 34 through 35. Well, the people had had enough of this blind man lecturing them. They revert to a belief that had at first prompted the disciples. They revert to a belief that had at first prompted the disciples' question about the man's blindness. You were born in utter sin, which explains your blindness, is in the implication. So how could you possibly teach us anything? That's verse 34. At the end of this heated exchange, the people cast out the man, possibly a reference to expulsion from a local synagogue. When Jesus subsequently heard about this, he found the man and posed a question. Do you believe in the Son of Man? That's in verse 35. This term refers to an ordinary, humble person who is doing extraordinary things in God's behalf. The man who had recovered his sight asked who the Son of Man was. If he did not know this man, how could he believe in him? That's in verse 36. Jesus identified himself as that man. That's in verse 37. Now, the newly sighted man calls Jesus with the honorific Lord and affirms that he indeed believes. More than that, the man worshiped Jesus, intimating his belief that Jesus was more than a man or even more than a prophet, but rather someone deserving of worship. Then Jesus concludes this incident by asserting that part of his ministry was enabling the blind to see while simultaneously rendering people who had excellent sight realize that they were in fact blind. Clearly, Jesus is referring here not to physical blindness, but to spiritual blindness. Some Pharisees heard Jesus make this astounding claim and asked whether Jesus had alleged that they were blind themselves. That's in verse 40. Jesus said, in effect, come to think of it, yes, you are blind. Had you been physically blind, there would be no guilt attached to that circumstance. But because they had been so adamant that they understood what had happened with the blind man, they condemned themselves with their spiritual blindness. Of course, the supreme irony of this story is that the blind man ended up having 20/20 vision, both physically and spiritually, whereas many of the sighted people could not see at all. In the end, this little story emphasizes that actual physical blindness does not prevent someone from seeing and seeing quite clearly. At the same time, one may have perfect sight, but be blinded by obstinance, religious prejudice, or being completely impervious to argument and reason. At the end of this podcast, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to allow this to be published without any editing. Most of the time, my podcasts are edited. And the reason I'm doing that is because May is Stroke Month. It's a national stroke month here in the United States. And I want to tell you just a little bit about my stroke that I had in 2014. It was a massive stroke. This was in December 2014, just before Christmas. And I ended up being paralyzed on the right side and having zero speech. Fortunately, my wife got me to the hospital within an hour, and the TPA was administered to me, and I'm kind of a miracle child for that medicine. The clot in my brain was dissolved within 24 hours, and my paralysis completely disappeared. I didn't have to do 1 hour of physical therapy because of that. But the speech, of course, did not come back. I had to take 10 weeks of speech therapy, basically to rewire my brain. After that 10 weeks, at which time I took a medical leave from the university where I was teaching, and then in the spring, I went back and taught one course. That's how excellent the therapy was. The condition that I ended up with is called aphasia, APHASIA. It's incurable. I will take it to my grave. Most of the time, I'm aware of it and I'm able to forestall it. In other words, when I'm trying to think of a word and I can't think of it, the therapist taught me to choose another word. Or sometimes I would get myself into a syntactical trap and couldn't figure out how to get out. Or sometimes just out of nowhere, I could not pronounce a word that I knew as well as my own name. Most of the time, if I'm careful, people do not notice much deficit at all. Of course, I do, but that's neither here nor there. I just want to let you know that I have nothing but undying praise, not only for the doctors in the stroke area of the hospital, but for these brilliant, wonderful speech therapists who actually can make you regain something as precious as speech. Of course, with any stroke, the first thing is so important is to do whatever you're going to do very fast. Don't sit around, don't wait, get to the hospital as soon as possible, because the sooner the doctors can get to you, the better your condition is going to be. I just wanted to let people to know that I am a surviving stroke victim, and I'm going to allow this podcast to be published with all of the flaws and the warts. My production company is always very, very good at getting rid of those, but sometimes it's good perhaps to do it just sort of live. At the end of this time, let me once again encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and record your email there so that I can contact you when we are ready for our mini courses. And also you can ask me any questions that you want me to respond to in the next Q&A session by writing me at fspina106@gmail.com. Thank you. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, Listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.